Hello and welcome to Stuart Saturday Live, Season 2, Episode 5, the Restoration Special. I'll be joined by Justine Brown in a few minutes. But first, I have a few things to mention. Last Sunday, the 4th of May, I gave a talk on Barbara Villas at the Sir John Moore Foundation Museum. The audience was delightful, and the building itself dates back to, I believe, 1697, during the time of William III. All being well, I'll be back at that lovely building in August for another talk. My next talk, however, will be at the stunning, historic Leicester Guildhall on Sunday, the 18th of May, 2025, and I'll be speaking from 2 p.m. to about 3 p.m. My topic will be Scandalous Stuarts. You'll be able to book your tickets by following the link under this YouTube video. As promised in our last show, our Cook with the 17th Century Lady playlist is now up. We'll be adding to it when time permits. As I mentioned earlier, this episode is all about the Restoration. But in order to understand how that came about, I think it's important to have the context leading up to it. So this will have to be a very brief overview of the run-up to this. So there were the Civil Wars, which began formally in 1642 between King Charles I and Parliament over a variety of issues. And here we have a painting depicting the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644, which was the largest battle of the Civil War and one in which many lost their lives. It resulted in a parliamentarian victory, as would be the case with the Civil Wars themselves. Following Charles I's beheading outside the banqueting hall of Whitehall Palace on a bitterly cold winter's morning in late January 1649, the interregnum began, and this word means in between reigns. So England was no longer ruled by monarchs, but was a republic. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector, and this engraving of Oliver Cromwell is by Jan van de Velde IV, circa 1655. Oliver Cromwell remains a highly controversial figure, as we've examined with several of our previous Stuart Saturday Live guests. His death in September 1658 led to his son Richard Cromwell's ascension to the same position. But this young man simply wasn't cut out for it, and the Commonwealth wasn't in a very strong position anyway. So this engraving we have here is of Richard Cromwell as Lord Protector, and that was made by Philibert Boutats and Hugo Allard, circa 1664. Power struggles ensued, and Richard Cromwell resigned in May 1659, and yet went on to have a long and pretty quiet life. Following Richard's resignation, the power struggles continued between the Rump Parliament and the army, and there was a great deal of political instability. The Republic failed, and public mood began to yearn for a return to monarchy, a restoration of the Stuarts upon the throne. So, how would this come about? How did it come about? My guest today is Justine Brown, who runs the popular vlog Justine Brown's Bookshelf and is the author of The Private Life of James II. And she will help me answer these questions and more. You may remember her from my interview on the 17th Century Lady blog, and we'll have a link to that under the YouTube video. So joining me live from London, England, please welcome Justine Brown.
Hello, my lady. Thank you for having me on today.
Hello, my lady. Thank you so much for coming to my show. It's lovely to have you. I see that you're bedecked and in a manner fitting. Very lovely. And you are very trendy. May I point out that Justine is wearing a face patch.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, Yeah.
Whatever it is. Yes, a face
So,
patch.
wow, these were all the rage, weren't they?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, especially in the 1660s, they were. I mean, they had two purposes. One was to cover up scars from the pox, which of course was rampant, smallpox.
Yep.
But people thought them very fetching, and they were a little bit controversial themselves. I know Samuel Pepys was quite taken with ladies who had patches, but he didn't really like his own wife to wear them because they were so fetching.
Yes. Well, I love it, and thank you for doing this for the show. So, Justine, since our audience has a general idea of the context in which the restoration took place, um, let's talk more about that whole situation. I mean, there was a state of chaos following Richard Cromwell's resignation, wasn't there?
Indeed.
Yeah.
He was not. He did not have the kind of personal charisma, I guess, and conviction of his father, and he didn't have the same sort of, he didn't have the same sort of background as a soldier. So he did sit. Cromwell was very much whatever you think of him, and I'm not the biggest fan of Cromwell, but he was somebody who knew how to seize power, and he did seize power at a time when there was quite a bit of chaos following the execution of Charles I and a lot of warring factions. So Cromwell, in some respects, he became a sort of kingly figure himself, and he pushed down all the kind of many tiny little splintered groups, and some very religious, some more politico-religious sects, and ruled England with his major generals. And it's a very odd and strange period in a lot of ways. I mean, one thing that isn't discussed a lot is that they abolished the Anglican Church, and we have to think sort of what happened to that, that institution and all those priests and ministers, and the entire superstructure, which was so important for the governance of the country. So just thinking of that, but the Stuarts were most of them were on the continent, although Charles II did fight with Oliver Cromwell after being crowned in Scotland. He came and led an army and fought the last battle of the English Civil War, the Battle of Worcester. And he then had to escape from the country. And it took him a couple of months to get out of the country in various disguises. And famously, I think it's quite important for our themes today, famously, he hid in an oak tree, I believe is near Boscobel House. And when Roundhead, that is parliamentary soldiers, were looking for him, he was up there with his friend. They spent, at least all day in this oak tree. And Charles then he became a folkloric figure, I think, in the tradition of the Green Man, and which is, people might know, a very ancient figure that we find in many of the oldest churches in the country, but it has a kind of pagan aspect to it. So it's a man with his sort of part tree, part man, his face wreathed in leaves. And it's a very ancient symbol, but because Charles hid in an oak tree, he became nicknamed the Oak Apple. And eventually when he did come back on May 29th, 1660, that day was nicknamed Oak Apple Day. And then his younger brother, James, was escaped to the continent as a young boy, disguised as a girl, and some of their brothers and sisters were left behind. But just there was an encampment of royalists in France and in the Netherlands, modern day Holland and Belgium, and from there, they negotiated an end to this period. So that was, Charles had a court, and he did his very best to sort of ensure that this court seemed like a royal court, that it was structured like a royal court, and that that he was believable as a king, and he had people coming to him all through the 1650s. He had English people, some of whom had been Cavaliers, that is, royalist supporters, and some of whom who were not explicitly royalist supporters, but got disenchanted with the Puritan rule and began to hope that the king would return. So what we see is several years of this negotiation, which and a couple of efforts on the part of the Stuarts to land. I mean, they did have plans to land at one stage. They gave those up. There was in other words, there was an ongoing kind of effort on the part of the Stuarts, and sometimes it looked bleak and sometimes it looked hopeful. And in 1660, suddenly things changed in their favor. And so then the Declaration of Breda was negotiated, and Charles had to provide for two important things. One was what would become of all the parliamentary supporters, and the other was what would become of the various religious factions once the Church of England was reestablished. So Charles had to promise that, and what he did was he said he would go after only the regicides, that is I believe it's 54 men who signed the order of execution of his father. But apart from those men, he would have a general amnesty.
Yes.
And the other thing was that he promised a toleration, religious toleration. Now,
right. So yes, so he had his own court in exile, so to speak, and is quite an impoverished sort of existence. And over here, following Richard's, time as Lord Protector, things became increasingly more unstable, and various factions were jostling for power. And so in came General Monck, leading the army south from Scotland, and they seized control and declared a free parliament. And in other words, he was an integral figure in bringing back or restoring the Stuarts to the throne. In this undated image, we see General Monck, now first Duke of Albemarle, in a stipple and line engraving by Michael van der Goot. And this is from the Yale Center for British Art. So King Charles II offered Monck any job he wanted, and the latter requested and was given the position of Master of the Horse. And to this honor was added a dukedom. Monck became the Duke of Albemarle in July and was given lodgings in the cockpit of Whitehall Palace. And he received land worth a whopping £9,000. So I think that's approximately £1 million in today's money. So it's he was well remunerated for his efforts.
Yeah.
So you did mention how the exiled Stuart family was living over on the continent. Let's go back slightly in time to when King Charles I and Henrietta Maria were still together before everything went downhill for them. Here's this lovely image, I think, this painting by Hendrik Gerrit's Potts, circa 1632 in the Royal Collection. So we have Henrietta Maria on the left, and she's with baby Charles, who was Prince of Wales, so he would become Charles II. And standing on the right-hand side is Charles I. So can we talk about their family for a bit, the little family they made together with quite a few children?
Indeed, yeah. Their relationship started off a little bit turbulent, but they became one of the most famously loving royal couples in history. When Henrietta Maria came to England, she was about 15 years old, and at that time, George, Duke of Buckingham, was Charles's favorite, as he had been James, his father's favorite. And as long as he remained alive, the relationship between Charles and Henrietta Maria didn't really flourish. But then, a silver lining to his unfortunate murder was that they drew together, and it's strange because the Puritans kind of wanted to depict the court as a sort of like a decadent court, but this is not the case, especially when we compare it to the Restoration court, or the court of James the First and Sixth, for that matter.
Yes, you're right.
Charles was a very virtuous man. He was uxorious. He loved his wife deeply. He valued married love. He wanted to promote married love and children, with marriage, and so many of the paintings in his wonderful collection, because Charles was probably the most, of all our monarchs, he probably had the best eye aesthetically, and had a huge, this is one of the paintings, many paintings collected. And he loved to celebrate his family, and he would stare at the beautiful pictures of his family, and so we had Charles and Mary and James, of course, and little Henry, and I am missing one, that is
there's Elizabeth.
Yeah,
and there was, there were a few, and unfortunately, I think there was a Princess Anne as well.
Yeah.
And then, of course,
little Henrietta.
Minette.
Yes, little Minette was the last one.
Yes.
Who went to France, escaped with her governess, and eventually became a member of the court of Louis XIV and married his brother, which is another fascinating story that needs more telling.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the French supported the Stuarts. It's important to keep in mind that Louis XIV was, in fact, their first cousin, because Henrietta Maria was a French princess, and they were closely related. The French did support the Stuarts all through that century, as much as they could without interfering with their own interest. They did have, during there's a French Civil War called La Fronde, which when Cardinal Mazarin was the head minister, and he eventually did have to ask the Stuarts to retreat out of France because he had to come to terms with Cromwell, and that was a low point for the family. The fact that this happened to them. So James cut his teeth in the French army as a young soldier, but he eventually went to join Charles in the Netherlands, and they were fighting together. And there's some interesting where they were fighting together against the English, and James would be admired because he always admired the English army, no matter whether he was fighting against them or with them. He would sort of be clapping for their successes on one side. But they were also hoping, they remained close to the channel, because they were hoping that either they would be allowed they would be restored, or they would be able to land and stage an uprising. So Monck was a figure who was kind of, he went back and forth between Parliament and the Royalist cause a bit. He was a moderate Presbyterian, and I think he was of the camp that wanted Charles to promise that if restored, he would install Presbyterianism, which Charles promised to with his fingers behind his back.
Wow. In the 1650s, the Stuart siblings had two of their younger siblings in captivity. There was the gentle Princess Elizabeth Stuart and little Prince Henry. And both of these children were the last to spend some time with their father, Charles I, very shortly before his execution. I mean, that I'm sure you would agree that it makes for a very poignant last meeting with this the what remained of the family in this country. Ever so poignant. But following Charles's execution, poor Elizabeth died a short time later in Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. And that's also where Henry was kept until Parliament no longer wanted to look after him. So he was also allowed to go to France and join the Stuart family there. Yes. And I often think about these children who were separated from their family. And that's something that I like to emphasize, was that the Royal Stuarts were quite close, and they had a very loving family. So, you don't always get that, of course, in these royal dynasties, do you? But this particular family were quite loving with each other. So, and I do think about their ages. They were so young to be away from their parents and their siblings, and to know that their mother was far away and their father had been executed. I mean, it's a terrible situation for young children. But now I'd like to focus now on Edward Hyde, who was Charles II's advisor. And I'd like to talk about his role during the interregnum, because he was not really well liked by Henrietta Maria, was he?
No.
Yeah.
There were two camps. Her camp and Charles's camp. They both wanted the same thing. They wanted the Stuarts to be restored, but they disagreed about how that would be achieved and the kind of religious settlement that would be necessary or would be possible, I guess. Hyde was a member of the Church Party, so he felt that the Anglican Church was the most important church that represented the interests of the monarchy the most. That was so that's true of the majority of Cavaliers. There were a lot of Catholics tended to support the king in this war, but the majority of Cavaliers were Anglicans. Some, but not all. And in general, the Puritans were one member of one of any number of Puritan sects. And of course, just to remind people, what this term Puritan, which people still use today, basically means a Protestant Anglicans initially who believed that the church had not been sufficiently purged of its Catholic vestiges. And so they wanted a fuller Reformation. That was what they were after. And I always stress to people, like, some modern people don't understand the kind of importance of religion in this and in this moment. I mean, personally, I believe religion is, in some form or another, is always with us, but we have been led sort of in liberalism to think of religion as a thing that is this private thing that has nothing to do with the state, and it's kind of over there, right? But so for that reason, it's important just to emphasize that religion and governance were very tightly bound together. And so for that reason, for example, James I would not accept the Puritans' reforms, because one of the things they wanted was to abolish bishops. And as he said, bishops crown kings. So for James I and VI was very aware of how tightly bound monarchy and traditional religions, sort of Anglicanism or Catholicism, were, and you couldn't if you got rid of one, he felt that you would also get rid of the other. So Cromwell's form of governance had everything to do with his religious views. He was a kind of independent congregationalist, so that meant that each individual congregation had its own, its own church in a way, its own kind of governance. Yeah, so they had to really work out what would become of all these different people with their different religious perspectives. Mm-hmm. So Hyde was very much of the Anglican Church party. He would like to repress other Catholics and Protestant dissidents, mm-hmm. whereas Henrietta Maria's camp they wanted to find an accommodation for Catholics, and they found that they needed to include Protestant dissidents as well. So that was usually, it was a question of coming up with a formula that would both restore the Stuarts and ensure good governance going forward.
Right, very complex. And in terms of his personality, I mean, how can we describe Edward Hyde? I mean, he was
incredibly principled. Mm-hmm. He wrote the history of the rebellion, which he began writing in 1642. So he actually wrote an account of the civil wars, which from a front row seat. He began it before it had even finished. So he was writing as he went through. Very incredibly dedicated, and eventually, when it came, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but he was so dedicated to the royal family that he didn't want his own daughter to marry into it, because he felt that he wasn't high enough, he wasn't a nobleman, originally, and that he didn't want to compromise their interests. So he was that dedicated.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get into that a little bit later on. But I also think he was a good judge of character, and so there is that. He thought William Villiers was a very noble person, but he thoroughly disliked his daughter, Barbara Villiers. So he was good. He was good judge of character.
I came across a nice detail, which I'm sure you came across as well, which is that when Barbara Villiers' family were dedicated Cavaliers during the interregnum, that on the king's birthday, May 29th, which became Oak Apple Day, that they would go down into the cellar and toast the king. And so in a way, they were celebrating, well, they were hoping for a restoration. They were celebrating, marking that important day, even before, it became Oak Apple Day or Restoration Day.
Yeah.
And the men, James and Charles, just loved those sort of women who had suffered alongside with them, and that was their preference.
Yeah. Yes, there was definitely that. So on the 23rd of May, 1660, Charles Stuart, Charles II, joined by his younger brothers, James, Duke of York, and Henry, Duke of Gloucester, departed from the Dutch seaport of Scheveningen on the English ship Naseby, heading towards the land of their birth, England. Aboard that vessel, which was promptly renamed the Royal Charles for obvious reasons, and if you don't know, the Battle of Naseby was a terrible defeat for the Royalists. So on that vessel was Edward Montagu, who had been general at sea and on the English Council of State during the interregnum. By the end of the following month, Montagu would be made the first Earl of Sandwich in recognition of his efforts on behalf of the Restoration. But also on board was Montagu's cousin and secretary, Samuel Pepys, who is now most famous for his diary of the period. Now, Samuel Pepys, what would we do without him? He's given us a wealth. It's just a treasure.
that is probably one of the most important documents to read if you want a flavor of the times. I also like John Evelyn. It's a different flavor, but another great diarist. He doesn't have, Pepys's earthy sensibilities or sense of humor, but he brings something else, But yeah, Pepys is a classic. But he had a front row seat. He was actually there as a child. He witnessed Charles I's execution, and he also witnessed the execution of those who could be rounded up who executed Charles I. So he attended the execution of several of the regicides.
Yeah, and I think it's incredible how we mentioned Samuel Pepys and you mentioned John Evelyn. I think it's wonderful how both of these would meet up on friendly terms and have a walk and a discussion, and I think that's just lovely. That's one of the lovely things about this period, that they were often in this close proximity and they would be able to socialize. So I think that's quite lovely. And how sometimes Pepys would say, I went for a walk with my friend John Evelyn, and it's lovely.
One of the things I love, because when people ask you if there was any historical event that you would like to witness, for me it is that day when the king rode into London on the white horse that was provided for him by one of the parliamentary commanders, Black Tom Fairfax, he'd fought against him, but as a gesture of goodwill, he provided him with the white steed that he needed to be the king on his white horse that we all that we can all envision.
I think Fairfax. I think most of us can agree he was a top bloke.
Yeah, he's of the parliamentarians. He's probably my favorite.
Yeah, I think that's my opinion too. So when Charles returned to London on the 29th of May, 1660, it was quite a homecoming, as you were mentioning. And this is an engraving of Charles from 1660. So can we talk more about that triumphant return to London? I mean, can you set the scene? I mean, what was it like that day?
Pepys gives a lot of wonderful descriptions of the day, that wine was running in the fountains, that flowers were being thrown and cast into the path of the return. So it was Charles with James, his Duke of York, at his side, with Henry, Duke of Gloucester, at his side, and then with this huge army behind him. Some of them, like the ones closest to them, the ones who had supported them and came over with them. And by the way, when their return was being negotiated, a lot of people pitched up in the Netherlands, in Belgium, saying, actually, I was always on your side, and would you kind of thing. So they were falling in behind, and then everybody, sort of all the, there was a kind of intent to create a feeling of reconciliation, between the sides of this very bitter war, and this period of time, which was marked by a repression of kind of traditional customs. Famously, the theaters were closed. The Puritans closed down the theaters for reasons. They disapproved of theater. They associated it with the mass. They felt that it was a place that produced vice. But this also extended to holidays, the traditional way that we celebrate Easter and Christmas. They banned sort of countryside customs like maypoles and maypole dancing. So one of the things that was set up immediately to greet Charles I was the hugest maypole imaginable, and there were maypoles all over the place. And of course, it was May as well. I'm so happy that we're having this discussion now, because I think we need to learn to re-embrace this period as Restoration Month.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, we still have a holiday on that day. but people don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's a shame because honestly, I make my own maypole in the backyard every year because they don't do one locally, which I think is a shame. But it would be a good time to mention that Oak Apple Day or Restoration Day was a public holiday to commemorate the historic moment when Charles II returned to the throne. And although it ceased being an official holiday way back in 1859, it has nevertheless been celebrated, okay, perhaps to a lesser degree, by people ever since. I, for one, celebrate it every year. I mean, just last year, we went, my whole family went down to the pub, and there was a lovely pub outside the gates of Chatsworth House, and it was great. I mean, do you celebrate it?
I do, yes. The Royal Oak would be the ideal place if you had a Royal Oak. It's quite a common pub name in Britain, as well as the Green Man is also a common pub name. And the Royal Oak is a reference to, see, the lovely thing about the oak tree, the fact that Charles hid an oak tree, is that the oak is a traditional image of Britain itself and of the English monarchy, and this sort of this feeling, this concept of the deep tradition that the royal family represents. So in a, the oak tree was cut down on January 30th, 1649, but it started, put up green shoots on May 29th, 1660. I thought, could I just read a little small passage from a book by the Duke of Newcastle, William Cavendish, who was a Civil War commander on the Royalist side, who went into exile. He was also had been Charles II's tutor as a young boy, when Charles was a young boy, of course. And while they were in exile, William Cavendish, who was living in Belgium, Flanders, wrote a book which in the Mirror for Princes tradition, which is a book of advice written by a knowledgeable, advisor. And he wrote that as a kind of way to encourage Charles for the future, hoping that he would be restored and giving him the wisdom that he had accrued as an older member of the nobility himself, who governed his own local area, but had a lot of experience as well. So he wrote this book, which is just known as the Little Book, and he was encouraging the Stuarts to play to their strengths in this department of Merry England kind of customs, the sense of like the old ways, the countryside ways, the things that were dismissed as pagan by the Puritans, the sort of pleasures, including the plays, but also May Day festivals and the like, Morris dancers and so forth. So he talks about what will be when you come back. So he knew that one of the things that made the Stuarts attractive to typically the people, the common people, was their embrace of this way of life, this old way of life that we associate with Merry England. So first he says, first for London, the several playhouses, there were at least 5 in my time: Blackfriars, the Cockpit, Salisbury Court, the Fortune, and the Red Bull. There were the boys that played at the Blackfriars and at Paul's, while the King's Players acted at the Globe, now called the Phoenix. Some played at the Boar's Head and at the Curtain in the Fields, and some at the Hope, which is the Bear Garden, and others at the White Friars. But 5 or 6 playhouses are enough for all sorts of diversion and pleasure of that kind. Then there will be puppet plays to please them, and besides, and also dancers of the ropes with jugglers and tumblers, besides strange sights of beasts, birds, monsters, and many other things, and all sorts of music and dancing, and all the old holidays with their mirth and rites set up again. There will be daily feasting in Merry England. And then he says for the countryside, May games, Morris dances, the lords and ladies of the Maypole, the Fool, and the hobby horse must not be forgotten, as also the Whitsun lord and lady, the thrashing of the hens at Shrovetide, carols and wassails at Christmas, with good plum porridge and pies, which are now forbidden as profane, ungodly things at wakes. And after evening prayer every Sunday and holiday, the country people with their fresher lasses will trip on the town green about the maypole. And he goes on in this vein.
How lovely. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I don't think I've come across that source before, so that's really particularly interesting to me too. So Charles II returned, and in the same year of restoration, whilst he was celebrating, he also sought revenge against those who had murdered his father, Charles I. And some of these were posthumous. There were several, including Oliver Cromwell, whose remains were exhumed and subjected to a posthumous, well, symbolic execution.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
A little on the ugly side, to be fair.
Yeah, indeed. And so this is from that time. But crowned a year later on St. George's Day, I believe, the 23rd of April, 1661, in an incredible ceremony. And we have this amazing portrait of Charles II. And it's one of my favorites. It's vibrant, it's commanding, majestic, and yet I think it's also rather sensual. Well, what do you think?
It's Wright, isn't it? Isn't it John? Is it John Michael Wright?
Yes.
I think so. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
One of the great painters of the era who is a little bit neglected. I mean, I love Sir Peter Lely is the most famous, and we'll talk more about him, I think. But John Michael Wright was a British painter. Some say English, some say Scottish. He was a Catholic. He also served Roger Palmer, sorry, when he went to Rome as part of a later delegation. But he was a fascinating figure, and just a painter who really needs to be seen more, I think. But it's a wonderful one.
Yeah, and I agree. And here we could see the shiny new regalia, because one of the most important objects that were commissioned during the restoration was the creation of new coronation regalia. Since most of the original sacred objects and items had been destroyed by Parliament during the interregnum and melted down into coins. Very few items survived this destructive period. But one of the items that did survive was a medieval coronation spoon, I believe, from the 12th century, I believe. And the items were created by Robert Viner, the royal goldsmith, and among the items were St. Edward's staff, the sovereign's orb, and most importantly of all, St. Edward's crown, which is named after the crown which had been used by all monarchs since 1220. And so we could see that here.
There was such a rupture. I mean, I think I still can't quite get over what a rupture it was when they executed Charles I, and abolished the Church of England and destroyed these objects. I mean, so the fact that the Stuarts were restored is a miracle in and of itself, and the efforts that they made in order to revive the old ways, which I think the common people participated in quite happily, but it is an extraordinary thing. The period that they passed through was unbelievably disruptive and bizarre in many ways. And then this kind of rebirth is just amazing, and we read some beautiful descriptions of that in Pepys and in Evelyn. I just thanking God for this revival, but these objects had to be the Queen's crown was eventually recast for Mary of Modena when she was crowned in 1685, but I believe that Catherine Braganza was never coronated, right? So they didn't have to create a new one for her at this time, for this crowning.
Wow. And during the Restoration, playhouses reopened, and with that came the first actresses.
Yes.
So that's really exciting. So many other enjoyments that had been frowned upon or playing band were allowed. And you mentioned maypoles earlier. But were there other things that were welcomed back? I can't remember at the moment. I think it was sports, wasn't it?
Yes. Certain kinds of sports had been abolished. I think it's again, the celebration of Christmas. The Puritans were extremely religious men, but their idea of observance, meant chasing away any kind of feasting. Well, again, anything that smacked of the Catholic traditions, right? So, and also anything. Now, one thing to mention, I think, about the pleasures that the court indulged in and famously promoted. I think this was their way of getting revenge without the sort of violence or ugliness that we saw with the regicides. I mean, it was, again, Charles promised that he would not wreak revenge on, everybody who had been involved with the Parliament. Well, with the faction of Parliament that eventually took over. But so he had to limit himself to chasing down the regicides that he could chase down. However, they were able to kind of thumb their noses at the people who had killed their father and destroyed their way of life by doing the kind of things that they didn't like, right? So it's kind of like you indulge in a kind of, like, in many cases, vice, right? Because stuff like having loads of mistresses and getting drunk all the time and that sort of thing. But you can also tell yourself that you're doing it for a good reason, you're or you're a politically useful reason. You're punishing people who crossed you in the past. And I do think there was an element of that when we see people, especially like the famously rude Earl of Rochester, Sir Charles Sedley. I mean, they were famous for getting naked in the streets and running around and just thumbing their noses at nonconformists, as they came to be called.
Yes. Yeah. And also Charles II, who was by this point getting very serious with a certain married woman named Barbara.
Yes.
Under him, the English Parliament repealed the Adultery Act. So it worked in his for his benefit too.
Yeah.
So could you please tell us about James, Duke of York, what he was like in terms of personality and interests?
So in some ways he intersected with his brother, but in other ways not. So James was somebody who threw himself into the pleasures of the Restoration Court. And we see this documented in, for example, the wonderful memoirs of the Comte de Gramont, which was ghostwritten by Anthony Hamilton, and is another document that I encourage people who are interested in this period read these because they are very funny. It's sort of a front seat on the court of the day and all the sort of romantic goings on, all the saucy running around. James was he was this more serious man than his brother. His brother was famously very extremely, witty and given to jesting all the time. And he had this air of, he came off as a little bit of a cynic, I would say, although Charles was more serious. He did take religious questions more seriously than people tend to assume, and philosophical questions. But anyway, James was he was more of a serious type, but he loved his pleasures. He loved women. He was known as like the greatest ogler in the land. Yeah. Both of them had a kind of competition to see how many mistresses they could acquire. Charles thought his were better looking, which he he famously thought that James had sort of unattractive mistresses. I challenged this notion because I think all these maids of honor, who most of them were, their mistresses tended to be maids of honor around the court. I mean, these girls were chosen in large part for their fetching looks. That was a big part of it. They had to be decorative around the place. So I think most of these girls were actually probably quite lovely girls, but maybe some were better looking than others. Like Barbara was incredibly glamorous, of course, and Frances Stuart was another who was a great, statuesque beauty.
Yeah.
James was a loyal, very loyal person, politically incredibly loyal. He valued that in other people and also expected it in other people, which I think led to a lot of pain in his life, because he was not very good at assessing other people's motives, I think, and especially when it came to political loyalty. So he suffered a lot when people let him down, and so I don't think maybe he lacked a certain amount of insight into other people's, motives and perspectives, perhaps. He gets a lot of bad press. I think that's because our current order is founded on the revolution of 1688, known as the Glorious Revolution. And so, James, because an anointed king of England was, basically just erased off the throne, despite being the legitimate king of England. I think there's a lot of justification, that goes on. So I think James gets a bit of a bum rap because of that.
Right.
He was a very brave man. He fought for his country. He fought he was the Lord High Admiral, appointed at the age of 4. So he was,
wow.
At a very early age. He fought. He was a great soldier. He fought the Fire of London first. He led the fight against the Fire of London. So, rode through the streets, directing. They had to blow up some buildings and things like that to create a fire break. So somebody who was very, quite an impressive person. But he definitely loved his women. He loved theater. He loved art. He loved music. He was a patron. Charles and James each had a theater that they were patrons of. So there's the Duke's Theater, which was James's, and the King's Theater, which was Charles's. And this era, which marked the beginning of women on the stage as actresses, was also a time when, for the first time, the monarchs went to the theater instead of having the theater come to them.
Right.
And they would go together and they would enjoy the theater together and stay out late. And they began taking certain actresses as mistresses. So that was an interesting development. So famously, Nell Gwynn was one of Charles's mistresses. And there were others as well. Moll, what's her last name?
Moll Davies.
Davies, And
or Davis, depending on who you write.
Yeah. So that was an interesting development. I think it was Rochester who kind of promoted that. He was maybe one of the first noblemen to take an actress as a public mistress. Like that.
I think that was Elizabeth Barry, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it was.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. Moving on to Anne Hyde. She was very important. So who is this lady? And why is she so important?
Yes. So here we have a picture of James and Anne, and their 2 daughters, Mary and Anne. Those two, the paintings of the little girls were painted in later by an Italian. So it was a Sir Peter Lely painting, but the girls were popped in about 10 years down the line. Anne was James's first wife, so she became Duchess of York, and she was Edward Hyde's daughter, and she was a maid of honor to Mary, Princess of Orange, who was their sister, who married into the to the Dutch. Is it technically royal family? But because the stadtholder
the
family.
stadtholder.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but effectively a royal family. So
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
Yeah, and it's confusing because she married a William of Orange, and then she gave birth to William of Orange, who then married Mary, who was
Yes.
James's daughter, and
Yep.
so there was another set of William and Marys, and that
Yeah.
people, understandably. So he met her when he was visiting his sister in the 1650s, and they were, they fell in love, and they began sort of creeping off together, and she got pregnant. Now there's a lot of like the way they behaved kind of reminds me of the sort of restoration comedies that we see, with a lot of people hiding in cupboards and breaking into people's apartments. In the case of James, she got a promise in writing from him that he would marry her because she was pregnant. Now, he knew that his family wouldn't like this because they wanted to have a much more like a princess for him, especially since they were in a very awkward, position out of power in the 1650s. So they were hoping James would marry someone, very, very highly placed. But so when the family, didn't want him to marry her, he and his friend broke into her apartment and stole the promise note. But then he eventually married her anyway, because she was so, he loved her, I think. She gave him warmth and affection, and also she had quite an impressive personality. So she's somebody who was initially a commoner, although a maid of honor. So but she stepped into the role of Duchess of York and became a patroness of the arts. So she just
exactly. Speaking of which, I think it was shortly after the Restoration, Anne, Duchess of York, decided to hire the popular artist Peter Lilly to create a series of portraits of the loveliest women at court. And these 11 portraits came to be known as the Windsor Beauties, for they hung in Windsor Castle until the early 19th century. Now, I really love them. This is a picture I took in the Communications Gallery at Hampton Court Palace. And they're sumptuous, dreamy works, and they're painted around between 1662 and 1665. But they have subsequently been criticized for the similarity of the faces of the sitters. I think Samuel Pepys said, when he looked upon the portraits himself, just shortly after they were completed, he judged them to be good, but not like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
they're beautiful, but they don't actually resemble the sitters, right?
Yeah. I mean, there is this popular idea that's put forward sometimes, that Lilly's great muse was Barbara, and he would therefore paint her eyes on everyone else. I don't know. Right? Yes. So that is something some people say. Well, perhaps he just wasn't very good at doing eyes. I don't know.
I think he wanted to give everybody, he did sort of give everybody this long, seductive side eye kind of thing. I mean, he did a few men in that vein as well, including James himself. There's a very attractive portrait of James by Lely, which hangs in Holyrood Palace now, where he has that exact expression on his face. But it looks like, James was a very handsome man, especially, as a young man, he was very, very handsome. So I don't think Lily had to, twist it too much to, I think he still looked like himself. I think it was just a mode,
Yes.
Pearls and
James was known for, yeah. I'm trying to do a Lily look today, with lots of this. So I tried. And the thing is, James was, as you said, very, very attractive. The Stuarts weren't exactly an ugly bunch of people. I think they were quite good looking. But it's very interesting, and I love looking at all the artwork from this period. And Restoration court life itself was well. Um, it had this beautiful art, theater, um, all sorts. Literature was just really beautiful in that respect. However, the Restoration Court was full of predatory male courtiers, some of whom did indeed view women as mere sexual objects.
Yeah, I think Rochester is one of those. Yeah, there he is. Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah.
And this is a photo I took of a portrait of John Wilmot, second Earl of Rochester, at the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah.
And he was one of the most infamous of the Restoration rakes or libertines. And since this is I try to make this a family-friendly show.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read any of his poems, but feel
No.
free, everyone, to go and look that up yourself. And yeah, you'll see. So going back to
Sorry, he gave one, but a satirical poem about the king he gave him by mistake, and that led to him getting sort of kicked out of court for a while.
Yeah.
In the Isle of Great Britain.
Yeah, that one was quite something.
Yeah.
But going back to your book, and I have it here. There we go. It's beautiful, and again, you have the John Michael Wright, isn't that that did this portrait?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, he's quite dreamy there, I have to say.
He is.
So this came out last year, about the same time as mine, and it's lovely. I haven't finished it yet, but you have a lovely section on a section of images and everything, very very well chosen, and it's lovely that James has his own story there, which I think, as you said before, he doesn't always get the best reputation.
Doesn't get the best press, but I think there's a lot to celebrate about James.
Yeah,
I think he just wasn't as politically astute as his brother, who just really knew how to handle these things.
Yeah, well, he had other qualities. I mean, everyone is good at different things. And that's something to keep in mind. But in your book, you mentioned that James's lover, Margaret Brooke, Lady Denham, was like a second Barbara Palmer to nudge the ship of state. And I thought that was a really good line. Would you please tell us about her and their relationship, please?
Interestingly, it was Barbara Palmer pushed them together, or pointed James in her general direction, because she came to court. She was Margaret Brooke was her maiden name, and she was the daughter of an MP and a very attractive lady. And she came to court hoping to snag the king, and Barbara, sort of realizing this, just sort of nudged James over there, and James just made a beeline for her. But so James is married to Anne Hyde at this point. He did, poor Anne Hyde did have a bit of a tough time with James's infidelities. I mean, to be fair, this was kind of expected. It was considered fairly normal especially for a highly ranked, member of the royal family to keep mistresses. And I think there are political reasons for that, as well as, personal reasons. One of the reasons was, the Europeans were often comparing and contrasting themselves with the Ottomans in terms of the system for producing heirs, and just leaving the kind of moral questions out of it. I think that sometimes you've got your two. You can either have, a marriage that produces legitimate children for the succession, or you can be a polygamist and have a whole bunch of heirs, right? And then you don't have Henry VIII's problem. But the dark side of that is that you can overproduce heirs, and what would happen in the Ottoman courts is that they would end up having, some of the heirs would go on murderous rampages and kill everybody in the, all the competitors. Yeah. Sorry, but I don't know how family friendly that is, but so anyway. they had, so when they talked about their mistresses, they moved from a period when mistresses were characterized in very chivalric, courtly love terms, where the mistress in medieval times was depicted as not necessarily your actual lover, but somebody who inspired you, somebody who you admired and desired, but wasn't explicitly your lover necessarily, to a much more explicit role as a royal lover and possible and producer of not heirs, but loyal men and women who would form part of the monarch's kind of support network. That was certainly the case with Charles and James, because Charles didn't have any legitimate children of his own, but he had many illegitimate children. And James had legitimate children, but it took him a while before he had a son. And there's another story that we probably won't have time for today, but the illegitimate children that he had, particularly the ones that he had with Arabella Churchill, were some of his best supporters and most reliable, and that were most loyal to him and gave him a lot of love and respect. So he was initially open to the idea with Margaret Denham, who is married to a famous poet, Sir John Denham. He was much older than her. He was a great poet, but and had lived through the Civil Wars and the Cromwell period. But he'd turned into kind of the crotchety old man who was a type in the Restoration comedy, the jealous husband who was just apparently just crying out to be cuckolded. That's kind of the mode. And poor John Denham was cuckolded by James with Margaret, but Margaret was the only of his mistresses who seemed to be playing a political role, seemed to be influencing him, seemed to, one of the signs is that clients will approach the mistress rather than, rather than approaching the patron directly. So rather than going straight to the Duke of York, they might approach the mistress, or in the case of the king, rather than going straight to the king, they might approach Barbara Palmer or one of his other mistresses. So these were signs that the mistress had a kind of official role and a certain unofficial role, but as a bit like in the French court, where the mistresses of Louis XIV actually played quite a powerful role in the court, right? So, but unfortunately, this relationship ended in tears. Sir John Denham was extremely humiliated by their affair, and he had a break with reality, and he went mad and thought he believed he was a god. And then she died suddenly after drinking a cup of hot chocolate, which was thought to be an aphrodisiac, and maybe I agree. But she died, and it was, thought that she might have been poisoned, possibly by her husband. Even Anne Hyde was sort of not, there were rumors that Anne Hyde was responsible because she was the wronged wife in this case. So this and but we have both Peakes and Evelyn complaining that James is paying way too much attention to this woman and following her around and taking her advice.
Right.
So she died very young.
Yes, it's a very sad story all around. James was not very discreet. He was completely indiscreet, actually. So that, and I do feel terribly sad for John Denham. But it was not all mistresses and frolicking for the Stuarts. Of course, in that same year of Restoration came the death of Henry, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest boy, the youngest of the brothers in September 1660. This is a portrait of Henry by Jan Bokhorst, circa 1658, 1660. And this was a huge blow, not just to the Stuart family itself, but some would later say, dynastically. I mean, John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys both had a lot to say following his death, because they thought that he was a prince of great hopes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, slightly off topic here, but Henry's story, I always thought it was sad that he died from smallpox at the age of 20.
Yeah.
So that inspired me to write a completely fictional thing about him some years ago, over a decade ago, the Stuart vampire. So he's very special to me, because I made him my hero in that.
There's some quite interesting this painting, and there's another posthumous painting which in this mode where he looks quite a little on the vampire side.
Yeah. Yeah, it just worked for me. Yeah. But also a few months after his death came the death of his sister Mary, Princess Royal and Princess of Orange. And so she contracted smallpox as well in December 1660. Mary had left her only child, a son, back in the Dutch Republic. And her husband, the William you mentioned before, William II of Orange, had died only a few days before little baby William's birth in 1650, meant that, so he had lost both of his parents to smallpox, and he therefore became an orphan at the age of 10. So that little boy would become William III.
Yes.
So, yeah, quite a tragic upbringing there.
Yes. Henry, there was this concept of the pocket prince. A pocket prince is somebody who could be manipulated by another party, especially if they're quite young. So there were hopes that during the Civil War period and the interregnum, that either James or Henry might be a pocket prince for Parliament. That they might be able to instead of Charles, they would replace Charles I and Charles II with a more malleable younger person, perhaps somebody who shared their religio-political views more. And there were some who hoped that Henry would be that person, so that he had more of a mixed government orientation. So in other words, somebody who believed in parliamentary monarchy more than monarchy or absolute monarchy, as some people call it. But so that was a disappointment for a lot of people who believed that Henry had a lot of promise in that direction.
Right. And following the death of Anne, Duchess of York, the widower James sought a new marriage. Could you please tell us about Mary of Modena?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, beautiful young lady here.
The lovely Mary of Modena. Well, when Anne died of breast cancer, and she and James actually converted to Catholicism together, just add as a little postscript that, well, James's conversion to Catholicism is one of them, is a massive political issue, which we probably don't have time to explore thoroughly today.
I think we could have a whole episode about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Anne and James both were very influenced. They read certain books together. They're actually Protestant books that they read about Henry VIII. And once they learned about what happened with Henry VIII and why Henry VIII broke with Rome, they both thought, oh, well, that's a silly reason. So they basically both converted, because they thought that breaking with Rome because you want to marry a certain woman or because you want to steal the wealth of the monasteries wasn't the kind of theological reason that they would have respected more. So so the upshot is that Anne dies a Catholic and James is a Catholic, and he wants to marry a Catholic. Now, he wasn't the only, his brother was married to a Catholic, Catherine of Braganza. His father had been married to a Catholic. So it wasn't as if a Catholic would have been off the table, but he specified that. He also specified he wanted to marry a beautiful woman. And I think when his agent went looking for a new bride for him, he had this, he knew that James wanted somebody who was especially attractive, perhaps because as a womanizer, James felt that he had a better chance, a woman who might keep, who might keep his attention had a better chance of keeping his, his heart. So
right.
A number of different women were considered. Mary of Modena did not want to marry, and she's from the lovely Duchy of Modena in northern Italy, which is quite close to Bologna. Her family were the Dukes of Modena from the Este family, a great ancient family. Many rulers, many saints, many great patrons come from that ancient family. And her mother was a Duchess Regent in Modena, her father having died, and she wanted to join a nunnery that her mother had founded, the Sisters of the Visitation, which were Salesian, from St. Francis de Sales had a hand in founding this order. And so when Peterborough, who was James's agent, came calling, she immediately rejected the idea. In fact, she was very adamant that she didn't want to marry and wanted to become a nun. But then she got a letter from Pope Innocent X, and in it he said that he had a different mission for her, which was to marry into the English royal family and help to advance the interests of Catholics in that kingdom, to protect them.
Wow.
So she did have a sense of, that there was something like politically that a bit like Henrietta Maria, actually. So Henrietta Maria she was inducted into the Order of the Golden Rose by Urban VIII, and she was given a special mission to protect the interests of the English and Irish Catholics. And of course, that came with some difficulties because obviously the Puritans didn't like that. But Catherine of Braganza also had a similar kind of, sense that she had a role to help protect the persecuted minority. And she did do a lot of work to found or sort of recreate certain institutions for women in particular. But so Mary was convinced by the Holy Father to accept James's proposal. So she came to England via France with her mother and a large train, and they stopped off in Paris and they saw Versailles, which had just been completed. And she was under the wing of Louis XIV. So even though Modena is obviously not France, it was part of at the time, people will know that Italy was, composed of a lot of small duchies, kingdoms, and republics that had different kinds of alliances. And the Modenese were allied to the French. So Mary of Modena was actually the French choice for James. And it was known at the time that James might very well become king because Charles didn't have any legitimate children.
Wow.
So that was Mary's, she was, she had.
Yes. Oh.
There's a wonderful place in Modena. It's an arch on the Duomo, the Cathedral of Modena, which depicts King Arthur's adventures, and it's an arch that sort of has these images of knights and with lances, and and it's an ancient one from the, I think, the 12th century. And I like to think of this. I sort of made a connection between this image of the mythical image of Britain, and Mary going to become, king of or queen, eventually to become queen of England, Ireland, and Scotland. I think she had only the vaguest idea of what England was, but she had a faint idea of what Britain was from these, not just the arch, but also just from people, the history, the adventures of King Arthur and all of that. Those tales were very much still the extremely common and extremely popular romances that were told and retold in different forms, among all Europeans and throughout Christendom. And just so she would have had this sort of familiar thought of Britain as this kind of mythic country, but she, as James himself said, she had no idea who the Duke of York might be, and she, she was a very kind of innocent person.
Wow, yeah. Very fascinating subject. We have just a little bit more time, so I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone, about a Stuart fantasy dinner party. Who would you invite? What would you serve, and who would you sit next to?
Well, I definitely know some of the people I would invite. I think I would want the Duke and Duchess of Newcastle. So the Duke who wrote the book of advice to Charles II that I read from earlier, and of course his famous wife, sometimes nicknamed Mad Mad. She was a extremely Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, was an extremely fascinating figure, and philosophress, as I like to call her.
Great word.
she I think this couple were very complementary. He was very supportive of her efforts as a writer, and she was very interested in natural philosophy, what we now call science, and she liked to dress in a very extravagant fashion. And she was extremely, she wrote plays, poetry, and all sorts of things. So, and a sort of her most famous work nowadays is called The Blazing World. It's you probably come across it. It's fantasy science fiction kind of utopian sort of.
Yeah. Well, where I live, she's very well known because I live near Bolsover Castle. So
I love that.
So the Cavendishes are very much part of this area.
Yeah, I'd love to visit that. So those two who came back from the continent with the Restoration. I think John Evelyn would be there. Perhaps even Samuel Pepys would be there too. Evelyn was such a brilliant antiquarian. He was a polymath. Just such a rich. He had such a rich, wide amount of knowledge. Perhaps Aphra Bain might be another one. Now, as for what I would serve, I'm picturing a lot of like things and jellied things that aren't necessarily tasty, but they're interesting to look at. But you know more about these recipes than I do.
Well, I do like to do some historic cookery. Yes.
Perhaps I would be seated between the Duke and Duchess of Newcastle.
That's a good place to be, I think. Yeah.
Well, of course, Charles. I think Charles II was obviously a very amusing dinner companion.
Right. Well, that sounds great. Wow. Yeah, that all those guests are great. So I'd like to thank you so much, Justine, for taking the time to come and talk to me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. Been wanting to appear on this show for a long time. So.
Oh, well, thank you. Justine's book, The Private Life of James II, is out now, but she has a forthcoming release later this year, Mary of Modena, James II's Dazzling Queen. And look at that brilliant, brilliant cover. I love it. It's published, it will be published by Pen and Sword History. And you can pre-order it now from the P&S website, Amazon, or your preferred local bookseller. I would like to thank my director and producer, Gavin of Orland Media, which is our family-run business. And we will very soon be releasing an exciting new audiobook set in the 17th century. Next month, I'll be joined by Dr. Mark Shearwood to talk about the Glorious Revolution. In the meantime, keep an eye out on my website and or my social media so you can purchase tickets for the Stuart History Festival. Until then, keep it Stuart.